Thank you to all our guests for coming to the stage. We would now like to open the panel discussion. Thank you.
So, Rachel, I was really interested about what you were saying about expanding the school out into the community. Have you had any thoughts or done research into kind of the safety aspects of the community, and how can we make spaces safe for children, because so many of them are just so badly designed and are actually designed to exclude students?
Well, I have to say most of my work is on creating healthy cities. So I'm interested in the way in which neighbourhoods are designed. And that's why I was interested in most of the chapters talking about beyond the school in other places, because if we can start thinking about neighbourhoods that are safe, that are healthy for everybody, so then you come back to universal design. So there is research on better places for children to play, access, safety, the design of buildings, the design of the spaces between those buildings. There's an awful lot to do, but I think architects and planners and who've looked at this and are interested in it have solutions. First, I'd say, again, in the West rather than in other places, but it then comes down to what I'd call design decision-making at a political level. And it's the same with a school. A lot of the decisions are not made by a community of designers who professional and non-professional. It then comes down to politics. And we're really spending more time with governance and local officials about how they see the neighbourhoods and how they see the role of health and education in neighbourhoods, because they're the predominant, obviously employment, so there's employment, there's education and there's health, the dominant factors in a neighbourhood as well as homes for living in. How do we rethink that? And how do we embed the school, the learning entity in that whole place? And I think there's some really great opportunities for a new generation of architects and designers and communities to actually think about that.
I agree.
So I was going to say, we've got an audience here predominantly of architects.
Yes.
What is the role of the architect going forward?
Going forward.
And
I don't even think it's going forward. It's something that I've always believed in since I studied architecture. There's a brilliant architect called Ralph Erskine, who's famous for the Biker Wall. And he was one of the very first who truly went into communities and spoke to people, who did stakeholder engagement. And for me, when I learned about this at the age of 21, 22, it was light bulbs. It was, this is the way that I want to be. So my firm belief is that we need to, in his words, we need to act as a lighthouse by which they might steer, rather than the navigator which tells them where to go. So there's no doubt in my mind that architecture has to be a collaborative process. We can't come in and go, we've got the solutions. It's worked in this school, therefore I know it's going to work in your school. Because every single school is different. Every single school is in, a unique position, a different part of their journey. It was so terrifying. A couple of weeks ago, we were doing some interviews at another school in Amsterdam. And we walked into this classroom, and the teachers, we could feel the aggression. And they started telling us some long story about a project in New Zealand where all the walls had been taken down and the teachers had to wear microphones because it wasn't working. And they were terrified that we were coming in to do the same thing. And we had to go, no. We are not coming in with preconceived ideas. We are talking to you. We are understanding you. We are understanding the school. And then we put pen to paper. So that's,
the social and critical and sort of curation role of architects is becoming almost more important, because people will say, well, you still got to make the building stand up and not fall down, and the engineering aspects of it. But actually, with technology, a lot of those aspects can be not taken for granted, but actually pulled in later on. But it's that social and curating role that and visionary role, and sort of the role of as a designer too, is somebody who can actually think about the future. Because if you ask a lot of people what they want now, they'll just want to sort of slightly improved version of what they've got. But actually, a role of an architect then is that sort of curating, sort of community engagement, and then empowering them to vision the future.
Absolutely. I think the point is not to say, what do you want? We never ask that question.
Exactly.
The questions when we go in, we're asking about education, we're asking about culture. We rarely talk about space, actually.
Yeah.
That comes much later.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I can share a very interesting example about the role of architects. So currently, some schools are working on upgrading the environmental performance of their schools. And in some of the situations, the architects are taking a very interesting role in introducing the sustainability principles to the children. So while they are sharing with the children what's going to happen in their schools, what does insulation mean, what does like having less carbon, like using less energy, what does that mean in carbon? They found themselves taking part of educating the children about sustainability, which is a new part of the curriculum. So that was a very interesting, I would say, story that I were thinking.
I mean, could I just ask, playing it from an educational point of view, one of my, as I raised today, is that I think we're de-skilling teachers in thinking about how they need to use space effectively to improve learning opportunities for young people. And, you know, I'd be interested to know how architects best promote teachers being confident and being part of the solution. You know, because I think we have skilled professionals who understand learning. They understand what they need to do to promote and motivate their young people, as do communities and parents. But I still, at the moment, feel that they're almost excluded at the front end of the process in order to use the value of that to help design the building. You know, and I would argue that, you know, from the work I do in design, is that I'm much more interested in the inside out rather than the outside in. And I just wonder, you know, how can we create that professionalism? You talked about people being concerned about open space and collaborative activity, you know, and I experienced that when I work in New Zealand. But often the reason for that is there aren't the right acoustics, there aren't the right quiet spaces being introduced, and therefore it's noisy because it doesn't need to be noisy, and there's no support for staff to transition into that space, because they go into it not having been part of the solution. So I wonder, you know, from an architectural perspective, how can we best sort of, because it's beyond at one school, isn't it? It's an international and global challenge. How can we improve that? Because teachers are key professionals and leaders of schools have roles to play in this. And I think there's still a bit of a disconnect.
I agree with you. I don't think it's easy. I think with all of our projects, we start with every project like this with something we call the strategic brief, okay? And the strategic brief is encapsulating all of that stakeholder engagement. Often a client will look at our fee proposal and go, so what's this? What's this at the beginning? You know, it's about creating awareness. It's about, and I have a ream of about 100 reasons about why a strategic brief is important, not least for saving time and saving money, which more or less everybody's interested in. So even if you can't get them on the so-called soft side of it, at least you can get them on the hard side of it. And I think, so number one, I think it's about raising awareness. I think number two, it's also about empowering those stakeholders. And when you begin that process, naturally, you'll have some who will be very engaged and some who will be less engaged and some who will have really thought through issues and want to have a discussion with you. In general, though, we find it to be the most incredible process, the most uplifting process for them as well as for us, and often very cathartic because no one has actually gone to a typical teacher and said, right, you know, how is this space working? You know, what's actually happening in this space? And so what's quite interesting is that they tell us other things as well about how the school is functioning. You were talking earlier about the school as a system. And so we are privy to a lot of information. So we're at great pains to say everything you say is confidential. It's aggregated upwards. But it's an empowering experience for them. It's an enjoyable, mostly, I like to think, experience for them. And we just, as TP Bennett, we're just trying to raise awareness. We're trying to say this is a success factor for, you know, successful projects. But it's a good question how we do it on a broader scale.
Yes, I think, you know, my experience has been that once you start talking to people in a supply chain, they can be very innovatory, but often they're consulted too late in the process, and you start to think about the interior design of the space way down the line. And if you were thinking about that earlier, then the nature of movement and flexibility and movement around a space does have major design implications, doesn't it? And often that's left too far down the line, and suddenly for head teachers, especially in England at the moment, who are looking for a building programme, who are obviously wanting the roof to be repaired and wanting all that to happen, I suppose I'd be making a plea that we need to start earlier. We need to start thinking about the change that you want to have in that space and bring those people in that can be very creative. And I think there is, as I said in my talk, there's a role for commercial organisations to be much more engaged in this, because they can innovate, but often they're denied the opportunity to innovate because it's not made explicit to them what they need to innovate around. It's just provide some chairs, provide some acoustic materials, And so I think we need to be much more expansive, really, about bringing those professionals into the process, because I think that would start to get a wider discussion,
And I was going to say that we should also be thinking about the relationship between the space and the equipment in it and the homes.
Yes.
Because different schools are in different neighbourhoods, and so what you've learnt from a particular home with no gardens, or some children don't have a garden or just have a balcony, is there a relationship we can design in when you design the school and the equipment in it, and how, all that children usually take home from school is a school bag and a library book or a book, but what's that relationship, especially as we now have the digital. So we have a digital world in which children are living in, as well as, so what do they take home from the school that's digital, and how do they engage with that? And, we saw that here, in the pandemic, there are certain areas where children did not have resources. They did not have pens and paper. So then we had school in a box that was delivered to their homes. So I think thinking about that again, that relationship between the building, the spaces around it, the neighbourhood and the schools, and what the relationship is and the type of... So I'd be interested to see if what you found reflects that, or could illustrate how we could go forth.
Absolutely. It was a kind of like an overlay between two institutions engaged in learning.
Yeah.
So you see all the complexity of having the school at home with the structured form of learning coming from school, with all different time rhythms of learning. And at some point it was a confusion for the children and the parents, because what was being studied in a certain way, in a certain schedule, in a relationship with a totally different social network, happened in a totally different context. So how to break down something that originates from a more structured institution into a different institution that could be maybe, I wouldn't say less structured. Homes are not less structured, but it's a different structure. So what does homework mean at this point? Well, all the work was homework. What was collaboration between children at the same age group, in the class, was collaboration between siblings of different ages. So there was a different mechanism of learning. Perhaps a sibling was helping a younger sibling. Perhaps it was a totally different mechanism of learning. The struggles were different. So the difficulty that a child could face in the classroom setting was totally different than the difficulty. For example, in the classroom setting, sometimes could be not being able to fit in the structure of the time of the schedule of the classes or the lessons, the boundary of the classroom. At home, it could be, for example, the noise from the kitchen. It could be the smells. Totally different experience.
And there are intermediate spaces between as well. So you have playgrounds, you have, cafes and hubs and things like that. So looking at it, thinking in the future, I like the word on your slide about architecture, or I think it was yours about, the learning architecture. Yeah. What is the learning architecture?
But and that's interesting, because I was going to ask you, with the project you were describing, I mean, that is taking, future thinking in design and learning to where it needs to be. Very applied, very hands-on, very collaborative, very project-based, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. And I think that's a great example. I guess I'd ask, again, from the architect's perspective, I mean, are we actually doing that across the world? Or is that just in small pockets? Because the question I would ask is that, going through COVID and all the things that we've learned going through COVID, in the work we're doing with some of our designs, we're trying to get schools to be thought of differently rather than a collection of small boxes, a larger box and a big space. Because in getting kids back into school, when they come back in, they're all at different stages. So assuming that Group A are going to be in that box and Group B are going to be in that box, when actually they've all developed very differently through the experience of home learning. And those young people want to come back in and they want to see themselves progress. So the space and organisation of spaces within schools generally, especially in England, is still the old, not the new. And so, how do you start to think about, well, I might want to come in and catch up with somebody. I might want to come in and have a discussion about some challenges I faced at home. That isn't going to be easy to come into 30 kids in one box in a normal organisational layout of a school. So, I mean, do you think that we are responding to that challenge generally? I mean, we are in certain projects. My own feeling is we're not doing enough to plan for the new. We're still designing on the old.
I totally agree with you. And I think it comes back to your point about the political question. Is the political will there to change the system? Because to some degree, it has to come from that direction, as well as a grassroots growing awareness of that school can be done differently. But I think the problem is it still comes back to assessment. It still comes back to the fact that certainly in Britain, I think you deliver a certain curriculum, you get assessed on that curriculum, you go to university, and there are other ways of learning. And I think as well, it's also predicated on a capitalist model of education as well, which I think needs to change to a degrowth model of education. I think that has to permeate the entire curriculum. And I think that that change is political, but I think it can also come from the schools themselves. I think it's happening slowly. I wouldn't say I would like to see it happening much faster. And the reason being is because I believe that it's the only way we're going to solve the climate crisis that we're facing now. If we start at school, and love your example about sharing when it's sustainability and you're teaching students, but it actually has to go much further. It actually we have to empower students as they are being educated in the direction of having the confidence to actually change things, to know from the beginning that they can change things. And maybe this sounds a bit sort of utopian, but at least we've got to go some way down that journey. And I think the idea of student-centered learning, what you're saying about the different spaces, also what you were saying about home learning, also connecting the community, I think it's, again, back to the NIASC learning principle of learning through space and time. So space is flexible, but time is flexible. So many schools that we work with are experimenting with breaking down the rigidity of the timetable. So you might leave the whole of Tuesday afternoon for project-based work, but that the students have decided themselves, I'm interested in building a drone, I'm going to go and do the research, I'm going to build a drone. And that's,
And I would guess that, if we're going to do that, then I think we need more studio spaces, we need more spaces to explore, we need a greater range of the experience, whatever age that may be, And I think that I just feel that, there is still this, it's just a political point, but I believe that most politicians don't really value the contribution of young people. And yet young people are being asked to engage and are engaging in everything we do around climate change and a whole range of areas. And I think that when you talk to young people about their experiences, they will tell you, won't they? They'll show you what they want to do. They're very honest, but they're not asked. So agency as part of future design, I think, does need to be taken more seriously. But then, how do we achieve that? But I think it's a very important thing to try and achieve.
I think actually we could go beyond that. Learning is a lifelong thing.
Yes.
So, people now, everybody, even architects, are going to go through maybe 4 or 5 careers in their life. So and also we know that, it happens more in Europe, but when you place an elderly care centre or some facilities for older people near to young people, they're mentally and more physically active. So actually, again, I would argue for this sort of whole systems thinking about how education and the learning entities that we have, like we should be thinking about health. So health in all policies, education in all policies.
But could I ask you then just on that, because I agree completely, but let's just put the spotlight there a moment, because to do that, I think would mean we would need to think differently about how we organise space in schools.
Absolutely.
Because the same old building, the same sets of boxes and spaces, to get that community engagement level. And it's interesting, all of my headships have been in community schools, and I've seen the fact that the community engagement locally, in some areas politically, it has sometimes been reduced. And the school itself is no longer as welcoming. I know there's health and safety and there's issues about care around a school site, particularly in other countries. But, how might we change the way we shape our buildings to make them more connected and more appealing to community activity? Because at the moment, it doesn't seem to be happening.
That's an architects and the communities question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yes.
I think we've got...
Oh, sorry.
Audience, ask the audience now.
Sorry.
Talk to ourselves all day. So,
They'll all leave.
the audience.
We'd now like to open the floor for questions from the public. Thank you.
There's one at the back up there.
You were talking earlier about using landscaping and zoning to direct cognitive learning levels. This is for Jane.
Yes, thank you.
How do you prevent that from becoming exclusive and sort of something that's a barrier in learning in areas where you're not able to completely transform the space to change how it flows, kind of? Like, how do you use landscaping in buildings that already exist that you can't change due to budgeting reasons and things like that?
I see what you mean. I think then it's a lower level of intervention. I think you can always take a space. Look, I'm an optimist. I always believe that there's a solution. Despite the budget, despite the constraints of the space, you do the best. Actually, you don't do your best, you excel. You try and go further. And I think to answer your question, possibly if there's a constrained space or a constraint with budget, then it's about what are the furniture solutions that we can bring to bear. How can we treat the walls? How can we create possibly what you saw in Antwerp at a smaller scale? And it can be as simple as, what we're working a lot with now is we say in a classroom, you might have somebody who wants to remove themselves from the group for a variety of reasons. Maybe because they are on the spectrum, maybe because I'm just having a bad day and I just want to face the wall. So a simple swiveling chair with a high back that we can turn, you can kind of be a bit removed, but you can still hear what's going on in the classroom. So it's exploring simple ideas like that, possibly with movable screens, with curtains, that are not too expensive. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
There was a question. Any more questions? Sorry. That's fine.
I had a question about community values. You said you based a lot of your buildings, school buildings, on values the community has and that way of learning. But I was wondering, if you focused on community values, would it be harder for the children in those schools to then adapt to values present in wider society?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. No, you go.
No. I think that's an interesting question. I think what is a value and how there are different levels of values and what people want to achieve. So I think often a community value will reflect some aspects of values in society. And that's a difficult thing to do because you are getting into a political space too. So this aspect of establishing values and an agreement is not a small task, is it?
No, I would agree.
No. I mean, I think though, to add to that, I mean, if we look at the way young people develop in the UK, primary schools are always of their community in the main.
Yeah.
And I think, that starting point about home and community And there are, I think, important values that are created in that way with young people and what they do. I take the point about how do you then translate that to the wider world. Yeah. But I think the wider world is coming in if we talk about climate change or anything else. So I think that what we need to do is to be clear and sure as an organisation at the primary level about what our values really are, the way we treat people, the way we work with people. And, you know, it seems to me that they're almost universal to some extent, that there's tolerance, there's people listening, there's engagement, there's valuing of you, there's looking at diversity of language and culture. And I think primary schools are always good at that. You know, they take it in that way because they're of their community. I think the question then comes with going on into secondary education, mobility across urban areas. Yeah. But I think that starting point, which is why I believe that from a learning point of view, we have to go deep with young people at that front end. We have to get them to be confident and to ask questions and to be resilient so they actually can take part in a strong way. So I think it's almost it's that early learning starting point, which I think we need to ensure we do. And that, I think, requires more attention, more time, more resource, and more, I think, focus on the young person themselves, from health, from well-being, and all sorts of other activity. So I think the way to deal with it is perhaps to start strong and start at a local level and build up in that way. Yeah. And I think that then gives a rite of passage where other things can develop, you know.
I also think, though, that the students should have a voice in the creation of those values. You know, certainly at Antwerp, when they redid their mission, their vision, and their values, that the students were very much involved in that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think possibly international schools are quite lucky in the sense that they can stand for something very, very clearly, almost actually that could be different to the local context that they might be operating in. And then parents come, and it's as much as about, is there a good fit for your student in this school, but are you a good family for this school to have good? That sounds pejorative. I don't mean to be. What I mean is, when you send your child to this school, you are accepting the values that this school lives and dies by, and are you prepared to do the same thing? So you can influence it both ways. Yeah.
There's a question here.
So I think it's absolutely fantastic looking at creating these spaces, but you know, once it's in place, have you found that you need to teach people how to use them? Because obviously we're in such a rigid system at the moment. Yeah. Has there been, I don't know, failed uptakes of really nice spaces? Has that happened?
I think that's been happening over the last decades in many, many ways, you know, and I think that suddenly you might have, with the growth of standardized designs and baseline designs, this is the way you now create a school, and this is what you're going to, and you have this. I think that where schools have tried to be different, where they want more practical, more engaging work, and they're working in more collaborative spaces, and the European and Australian and New Zealand schools work in that way, you do have to, I think, take the staff with you as to the value of working differently. And I think many of the failures of a lot of the developments in more collaborative spaces in schools is because the staff and the community haven't seen the value of working in that way, and they haven't talked that through. So when you transition into the space, it's full of surprises, and then it tends to go backwards. So I think the engagement levels early on, very early, as to why it's going to make a difference and improve the teaching, which is back to my point about, you know, teachers having skilled processes, but transition is always ignored. So I think, you know, there's never been money or funding to support schools to transition.
And I would say the principles of using a space are quite important. Yeah. If you start having very open plan spaces where they're designed and the furniture's in a certain way and they're designed, people do not feel ownership. So, you know, people will go in, they'll use a space, they'll leave, mess around, they won't tidy up after they've left. And it's a silly thing, but but if that builds up and people don't own it, they don't look at the use, management and maintenance of that. And that has to be designed in by the architects as well. Yeah. How our space is used, how it's managed over time, and how it's maintained over time is crucial, because in fact, the design and build is about that much. The use, management and maintenance is about that, you know, that much. And people forget about the principles of, you know, when open plan and when people are using that space and when they're on the phones or when they want to meet people, that whole thing has to be dyed into a culture, and you have to that has to keep on going over the generations, because a new generation of staff, students come into that space. If they don't understand the principles of collaborating, feeling responsible and ownership of that space, it can destroy the actual original.
Yeah, and I think,
Can I say one thing
sorry.
about leadership has to actually model how the space is used. And I realized with my presentation, it may have sounded as though Andreas was the man with the vision and everybody, he's not. He's an incredibly collaborative head of school, and he works with the entire school consistently and constantly to move it forward. He goes into that STEM zone. He has an office. He goes into the STEM zone and works in the middle of the STEM zone. So any student can approach him. He can sit there. He can get his work done. But he's modeling that behavior. He's modeling how to use that space. And I think that's another important.
It is, but I think that is very important. And I think linking back to your question, though, it goes back to, for me, for young people. I mean, as the head of many schools, I know that if you engage young people, they will ensure there's consistency in the way that space is used. If they're co-creating the learning activity, then teachers suddenly realise that young people support the learning in a co-creative way, and suddenly it doesn't become a burden. Suddenly it doesn't become a problem, because they are sharing the use of the space. So I'll just go back. I know I've made the point several times, but I think we are not valuing the fact that young people are eager and keen to learn. They just need to be liberated a little bit and allowed to do so. And in our projects, the staff will tell you that the stress for the learning processes are all down, because the young people are getting their resources. I don't have to go around as a teacher and do everything, lead everything. The young people are helping each other, and that takes the strain out of the use of that space. And actually, it's self-managing. If you have teachers that have to keep doing it and they are absent or they change, the culture has to be part of the kids. And I think that's the only way to do this. And I think often they're not involved in that process. And I think then it becomes more difficult.
Well, is there one last question? Sorry. Just a minute.
Hi. You talked about the discrepancy between the two contexts where learning takes place, like school and home. I was wondering if the solution between that is trying to align them and maybe designing the home to be more like a school, like you said, with little offices for the kids where they can work, or making the school more open, or we should understand the differences between them and do them separately and say that there's a completely different context for learning, or if they should try and make it one from a design perspective.
Well, the takeaways from looking at learning at home is seeing different agencies and seeing different ways of making the space, like the learning space. So, for example, the children returning back to schools after the lockdown, they are now having a totally different experience or understanding of their role in shaping the spaces where they study. So at home, they know that they can do this and this and that to make things better, or they know that this will make things harder because it was maybe a less structured way to explore how to make it. So that's the learning that could be taken for the design of school environments, knowing that they have a different role and they understand their agency in making the space in their schools. And the other way around in their homes, now perhaps there is a lot of talking about working from home and preparing the homes for adults to work, but at the same time understanding how the children studied and how the children did the homeschooling. It now raises the question to the design of the home, because now the children know the internet. They know that they can study and get to know more things from, they access websites. So if they don't understand something from the teacher, they can catch up through the websites. They can get more access to hobbies through the internet. So they know that the space in the home, they are more dwelled in learning in the home. And that makes it more and more important to understand and to design the space that gives the children different ways of learning, because that's actually what emerged during the lockdown. It was the different ways of learning. And their also their agency in shaping how they learned. the sources of what they learned. So they also know, and they have this space of their freedom in growing and developing their skills. Now they don't, you know that learning is not only the book, the learning is skills and developing skills. Right. So they need a more appropriate space for this to happen. And there needs more and more understanding of what kind of space that they need for this. Is it only their bedroom? Is it now, do they need now a different space? Like, is it, they didn't like the conservatory, by the way, at all. But is it like more like, is it the attic getting more important for the children? Is it more separated? Or do they still need to be around the parents, but still doing things like separately? These are all questions about what type of space that will suit the new ways of learning that the children explored, that they can do, things that they can do.
And could I just add to link that to the new ways of learning, because in the work we were doing with schools after COVID, it was pretty clear that young people were learning in a whole variety of different ways, you know?
Yeah.
And as you're suggesting. So I would just challenge and say, you know, so in our school designs, especially in the UK, we haven't really addressed that. You know, young people are coming back in, and we're suggesting that you and I and all people on this stage here are all at the same point. So to bring them back in after COVID and say, we assume you're here, and we assume you're here, and we're going to put you in this box here, and actually not assume that you've done other things, and you've got more skills and you've developed. I mean, that is no way to get that individual progression. Yeah. And that readiness to succeed. So I think we're not learning those lessons in design, because if I was designing something like that, I'd want a much more flexible space. I'd want a space to come out, a space to meet, a space to catch up, a space to have interventions, because we're dealing with individual learning opportunity and support. And I don't think our school buildings are getting anywhere near doing that. And I think that's really where we need to go.
Yeah, I see it more as a continuum as well. I think you've got the home learning and you've got the school learning. And I think one thing maybe we haven't addressed enough today is the idea of flourishing, the idea of well-being. So physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. And sadly, for many students, for a variety of reasons, coming to school is an escape from home life. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're not only supporting learning, but we're also supporting student well-being. And how do we do that within the spaces as well? I think that's vitally important.
It's very hard with 30 kids in 56 square metres.
I agree.
Exactly. I think that's where we have to finish now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for this discussion. Please give a big applause to our morning panel.